World War and Peace. Here are the members of Group 6. Quincy Sangkap, Angelica Velasquez, Jamaica Santos, Jessica Villanueva, John Carlos Sipin, Jeneline Taruk, Rica Ella Sampang. And now we're going to talk about World War I, World War II, Cold War, and World Peace. World War I, also called First World War or Great War, an international conflict that in 1914 to 1918. Disagreements in Europe over territory and boundaries, among other issues, came to a head with the assassination by a Serbian zealot of the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria on June 28, 1914. Exactly 1 month later, war broke out, and by the end of 1915, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire were battling the Allied powers of Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Belgium, Serbia, Montenegro, and Japan. In 1917, the U.S. entered the war after the British passenger liner, the Lusitania, was sunk by a German submarine, killing 128 Americans. A collection of significant facts about World War I. The onset of war. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Francis Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb nationalist. War first. Chemical warfare, gas masks, flamethrowers, steel helmets, tank battles, aerial warfare, aircraft carrier, IQ tests, guide dogs, a blood bank, women enlisted, film propaganda, military use of X-rays, and wireless communication. The Treaty of Versailles imposed very rigid restrictions against Germany, including limiting its army to 100,000 members. President Wilson, who opposed the treaty, had developed his own form of reconciliation, called 14 points. The points included a provision for a League of Nations to prevent the crime of war. Wilson also wanted all terms of settlement to be openly negotiated. But the actual terms of the treaty included secret arrangement for distribution of conquered German territories among the Allied nations. Many historians believe these terms eventually led to World War II.
The picture shows Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie riding in an open carriage at Sarajevo shortly before their assassination on June 28, 1914. World War I was finally over. This first global conflict had claimed from 9 million to 13 million lives and caused unprecedented damage. Germany had formally surrendered on November 11, 1918, and all nations had agreed to stop fighting while the terms of peace were negotiated. On June 28, 1919, Germany and the Allied nations, including Britain, France, Italy, and Russia, signed the Treaty of Versailles, formally ending the war. Versailles is a city in France 10 miles outside of Paris. World War II was the biggest and deadliest war in history, involving more than 30 countries, sparked by the 1939 Nazi invasion of Poland. The war dragged on for 6 bloody years until the Allies defeated Nazi Germany and Japan in 1945. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, U.S. and President Harry S. Truman and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin meeting at Potsdam, Germany, in July 1945 to discuss the post-war order in Europe.
Germany repelled on 2 fronts after storming across Europe in the first 3 years of war. Overextended Axis forces were put on the defensive after the Soviet Red Army rebuffed them in brutal Battle of Stalingrad, which lasted from August 1942 to February 1943. The fierce battle for the city named after Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, resulted in nearly 2 million casualties, including the deaths of tens of thousands of Stalingrad residents. As Soviet troops began to advance on the Eastern Front, the Western Allies invaded Sicily and southern Italy, causing the fall of Italia dictator Benito Mussolini's government in July 1943. The Allies then opened a Western Front with the amphibious D-Day invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. After gaining a foothold in northern France, Allied troops liberated Paris on August 25, followed by Brussels less than 2 weeks later. Battle of the Bulge. Germany found itself squeezed on both sides as Soviet troops advanced into Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania, while the Western Allies continued to push eastward, forced to fight a two-front war with dwindling resources. An increasingly desperate Hitler authorized a last-ditch offensive on the Western Front in hopes of splitting the Allied lines. The Nazis launched a surprise attack along an 80-mile, densely wooded stretch of the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg on December 16, 1944. Camouflage tanks and infantrymen wearing snow capes move across a snow-covered field in the Ardennes Alsace campaign of the Battle of the Bulge, 1945. The German onslaught caused the Allied to bulge, but it wouldn't break during 6 weeks of fighting, in sub-zero conditions that left soldiers suffering from hypothermia, frostbite, and trench foot. American forces withstood the full might of what was left of Germany's power but lost approximately 20,000 men in what was their deadliest single battle in World War II. What became known as the Battle of the Bulge would turn out to be Germany's last gasp as the Soviet Red Army launched a winter offensive on the Eastern Front that would have them at the Oder River, less than 50 miles from the German capital Berlin by the spring. Germany surrenders. After the firebombing of Dresden and other German cities that killed tens of thousands of civilians, the Western Allies crossed the Rhine River and moved eastward, toward Berlin. As they closed in on the capital, Allied troops discovered the horror of Holocaust as they liberated concentration camps such as Bergen, Belsen, and Dachau. With both fronts collapsing and defeat inevitable, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker deep below the Reich Chancellery on April 30, 1945. Hitler's successor, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, started peace negotiations and on May 7 authorized General Alfred Jod to sign an unconditional surrender of all German forces to take effect the following day. Stalin, however, refused to accept the surrender agreement inked at the headquarters of U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower in Reims, France, and forced the Germans to sign another one on the following day in Soviet-occupied Berlin. Allied soldiers and others read copies of the Stars and Stripes military newspaper belonging to the London Times that announces Germany surrender in World War II on May 7, 1945.
Number 4. Atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Even after the Allied victory in Europe, World War II continued to rage in Pacific theater. American forces had made a slow but steady push toward Japan after turning the course of the war with victory at June 1942 Battle of the Midway. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in the winter and spring of 1945 were among the bloodiest of the war, and the American military projected that as many as 1 million casualties would accompany any invasion of the Japanese mainland. Weeks after the first successful test of atomic bomb occurred in Alamogordo, New Mexico on July 16, 1945, President Harry Truman, who had ascended to the presidency less than 4 months earlier after the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt, authorized its use against Japan in the hopes of bringing a swift end to the war. On August 6, 1945, the American B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the manufacturing city of Hiroshima, immediately killing an estimated 80,000 people. Tens of thousands later died of radiation exposure. When Japan failed to immediately surrender after the bombing of Hiroshima, the United States detonated an even more powerful atomic bomb on Nagasaki 3 days later that killed 35,000 instantly and another 50,000 in its aftermath. A man wheels his bicycle through Hiroshima days after the city was leveled by an atomic bomb blast, Japan. The view here is looking west-northwest about 550 feet from where the bomb landed, known as X, on August 6, 1945. Number 5. Soviets declare war. Japan surrenders. In addition to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan came under increasing pressure when the Soviet Union formally declared war on August 8 and invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria in northeastern China. With his imperial council deadlocked, Japan's Emperor Hirohito broke the tie and decided that his country must surrender. At noon on August 15, Japanese time, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender in the first ever radio broadcast. On September 2, World War II ended when U.S. General Douglas MacArthur accepted Japan's formal surrender aboard the U.S. battleship Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay along with a flotilla of more than 250 Allied warships.
As World War II was ending, the Cold War began. This was to be a long-lasting and continuing confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, lasting from 1945 to 1989. It was called the Cold War because neither the Soviet Union nor the United States declared war on each other. However, both sides clearly struggled to prevent the other from spreading its economic and political system around the globe. Many American leaders believed that the Soviet Union hoped to spread communism all around the world. Communism was an expansionist ideology in theory and was assumed by many people to be spread through revolution. It suggested that the working class would overthrow the middle and upper classes. With the Soviet Union occupying much of Eastern and Central Europe following World War II, many Americans believed that communism had to be resisted. Some of the leaders of the Soviet Union were convinced that the United States intended to wage war against the Russian people. The American use of atomic bomb against Japan demonstrated to the Soviets that the United States was a possible military threat to the stability of the Soviet Union. The Soviets also opposed a quick return of sovereignty to the German people after the World War II. The Germans had invaded Russia twice in the first 4 decades of the 20th century and killed million peoples of Russians. The Soviets wanted to occupy Germany to prevent yet another attack. The Americans wanted to allow the Germans to rule themselves as quickly as possible. During the Cold War, the United States participated in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, the Vietnam War from 1964 to 1973, and several other conflicts to prevent the spread of communism. Approximately 4,700 Ohioans died in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The government of the United States began several other programs to prevent the expansion of communism. In the years after World War II, many Americans became concerned that communism might spread to the United States and threaten the nation's democratic values. Both the federal government and state governments reacted to those fears by attacking perceived communist threats. One of the main tactics used at the federal level was the creation of various investigative committees. Senator Joseph McCarthy chaired one such committee and hoped to end communism influence in the federal government. Thousands of federal government workers were suspected of communist loyalties, and many of these people lost their jobs. The federal government also investigated the motion picture, television, and radio industries. It was believed by many people at the time that communists might be attempting to spread their message through the American media. In 1951, the Ohio General Assembly created the Ohio Un-American Activities Committee. This was a joint committee of states representatives and senators charged with determining communism's influence in Ohio. The committee was based on the federal government's House Un-American Activities Committee. Its members received sweeping power to question Ohioans about their ties to communism. Between 1951 to 1954, the Ohio Un-American Activities Committee, headed by House member Samuel Devine, questioned 40 Ohioans, asking each person, "Right now, are you an active member of the Communist Party?" Every person refused to answer and cited the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution protecting Americans against self-incrimination.
Many of the person's questions were college students or people who had favored socialist or communist programs to end the Great Depression of the 1930s. Various grand juries eventually indicted the 40 people. 15 of the accused were convicted of supporting communism. In 1952, the Ohio Un-American Activities Committee contended that 1,300 Ohioans were members of the Communist Party. In 1953, the Ohio General Assembly, with Governor Frank Lachey's approval, extended the existence of the Ohio Un-American Activities Committee. Lachey generally opposed the committee's actions, but he faced great pressure from Ohioans who wished to continue to seek out communists. The governor contended that the committee's actions might put into grave danger the reputations of innocent people against whom accusations can be made on the basis of rumor and frequently rooted in malice. However, he also said communism is a menace to our country. Governor Lachey vetoed a bill that would impose jail terms and monetary fines for anyone found guilty of communist leanings. However, the Ohio General Assembly passed the bill over the governor's veto. By the mid-1950s, the lengthy investigations of people suspected of communist sympathies generally came to an end. However, many Americans continued to be concerned about communism and its influence. The Cold War continued until the late 1980s. Conflicts over communism in Cuba and South Vietnam dominated the 1960s and 1970s. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the United States began to produce as many nuclear warheads as possible to deter the Soviets from launching their own nuclear attack against America. This strategy, encouraged by President Ronald Reagan, helped the United States emerge victorious from the Cold War. The Soviet Union attempted to expand its own military power to meet the challenge of the United States. However, the Soviet economy was not as strong as the American system, and the building campaign destroyed the Russian government's ability to meet the needs of its people. By the late 1980s, people across Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union rose up against their communist governments. The Cold War came to an end.
Long peace is a term for the unprecedented historical period following the end of the World War II in 1945 to the present day. The period of the Cold War 1945 to 1991 was marked by the absence of major wars between the great powers of the period and the United States and the Soviet Union. First recognized in 1986, the period of relative peace has been compared to the relatively long stability of the Roman Empire, the Pax Romana, and Europe. In the 1990s, it was true that the long peace was a unique result of the Cold War. However, when the Cold War ended, the same trends continued in what has also been called the New Peace. The period has exhibit more than a quarter of a country of even greater stability and peacefulness, and has also shown continued improvement in related measurements such as the number of cops. The amount of repression and the durability of peace settlement through civil wars and resource military conflict occurred. There has been a continued absence of direct conflict between any of the largest economies by gross domestic product. Instead, wealthier countries conflict involving smaller economies have also gradually dropped off. Overall, the number of international wars decreased a rate of 6 per year in 1950s to 1 per year in the 2000s, and the number of uh, fatalities is decreased from 240 reported deaths per million to less than 10 reported deaths per million. In 2012, the European Union was awarded by Nobel Peace Prize for over 6 decades contributed to the advancement of peace and reconciliation democracy for human rights in Europe. By a unanimous decision of the Norwegian Nobel Committee.
Always remember, peace cannot be achieved through violence. It can only be attained through understanding.